Alright, so the Silent Hill 2 remake just launched. Well, not officially, it launches on the 8th of October, but I got early access, and today we'll be testing the RTX 4070 Ti Super. I've got all the specs on the screen right now, but we've got a 14600KF CPU. That again is paired with 32 gigabytes of DDR5, 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory, and I have to say the game is kind of underwhelming when it comes to performance. So I'm just going to be testing in this small starting area here. Just it's a little bit easier to test, and it's also very demanding. We are at 1080p on the Epic preset, and we're not hitting 90 frames per second at all times. Now, just one thing that I want to point out is the frame time graph is very, very inconsistent. But if you change the affinity to P cores only, then the frame time graph becomes much smoother, right? So I'm just using CapFrame X to change the affinity. I know that I've got the MSI Afterburner overlay on the screen right now, not CapFrame X, but just look at the frame time graph. I'm going to, now it's running only on E cores, and now it's running on P and E cores, and you can see that the frame time graph is very erratic. So I'm just going to be using only the P cores. I set it to P cores only now, and you can see the frame time graph is very smooth. This doesn't happen on my 12700K for some reason. This only happens on this 14600K CPU, but you can see here on the Epic preset, it's really not it's really not performing that well. So I'm just going to run down the stairs here and show you the stutters. There's a big stutter there. The game stutters a lot. There you go. It really is very annoying. The game is pretty bad when it comes to stutters, and I really hope that by the time the game launches officially tomorrow, that there would be a day one patch to address the issues, because I do think it is it's annoying, right? We don't have ray tracing enabled either here, and we're barely getting 90 frames per second with a 4070 Ti Super at 1080p. Unacceptable, I would say. Alright, so what I'm going to be doing, I just showed you my benchmark run here. What I'll do is I'm going to do preset scaling first, and then I'm going to do DLSS scaling, so upscaling, scaling, and then we'll change resolution. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to find quite a little bit of a heavier spot just to stand still and do the preset scaling. One thing that you can do to improve performance quite a lot is just reduce shutter quality. That helps a lot. All right, so standing still here, we're getting 88 frames per second. I'm going to switch between the presets now, just so you can get a feel of how the presets actually scale. All right, so on the high preset, we're getting 111, 112 frames per second. So quite a decent boost our frame rate there. And we are still very GPU bound. I know I'm not showing the lows. I'll show the lows when I do my 1440p benchmark run. Right, let's drop this down to the medium preset. Right, so the medium preset took us from 112 frames per second to 116 frames per second. So in the specific scene, really doesn't help that much. But you can see in the distance, there's quite a lot of flickering when it comes to shadows and reflections. Now, this game does support Lumen. It uses Lumen at all times. And then the ray tracing toggle, as far as I've got it, it's just to toggle hardware ray tracing, right? So it always uses ray tracing. I think it uses reflections and GI, so global illumination, Lumen, and then the ray trace setting just enables hardware ray tracing. All right, so that's the medium preset, and if we drop down to the low preset, wow. So going from medium to low, we are sitting at 161 frames per second here. We're still pretty GPU bound, although our GPU power is sitting at around 210 watts, which is quite a lot less than what it was on the Epic preset. So 161 frames per second here. So that's actually a pretty big boost to our frame rate, just going down to low. All right, I'm going to set it back to Epic, and then we'll just play with the DLSS upscaling. All right, so we're back here just at native on the Epic preset, so 92 frames per second. I'm going to enable DLSS quality, then balanced, and then performance. Although at 1080p, I really do not recommend anything higher than DLSS quality. I personally don't use DLSS quality at 1080p either, but in this game, seems to be quite demanding, quite GPU heavy, so it's probably necessary. Alright, so DLSS quality here at 1080p on the Epic preset took us from 90 frames per second to 120 frames per second. So let's see if there's any further scaling by going to balanced preset. Right, and the balance preset took us from 122 frames per second to 127 frames per second. But just look at the leaves blowing across the screen here. There's a lot of ghosting. So, and unfortunately, this even happens on DLSS quality at 1440p. The game does have quite a lot of technical issues, which I really do hope gets resolved before the game officially launches on the 8th of October. Right, so DLSS balanced. It still looks okay. I think not ideal, but I'm not going to be testing too much further at 1080p. I don't think I just want to see what the image quality looks like on DLSS performance, but I would highly recommend you not use DLSS performance at 1080p. Alright, so here we are at the DLSS performance, and we went from around 128 frames per second to 135 frames per second. But just look in the distance, the trees, they become a lot more blocky. Even at DLSS quality, they are very blocky, but I think the game looks okay even at DLSS performance, which is kind of weird because we are now rendering internally at 540p, right, half resolution basically. Yet it still looks kind of acceptable. I don't know. Like, obviously you will see a lot of issues in power lines, like, no, not even like if you if you have a look at the power lines here, they are pretty stable. The tree leaves are pretty stable. The DLSS implementation is really not that bad, except for the ghosting and then also the blockiness of the trees in the distance. Although I'm not sure if those trees are actually rendered the same as the closer trees, because you can't really go further than this. Well, further than a small building here, it stops you. So maybe they don't really form part of the geometry that gets rendered here. I might be mistaken, but that's what I think, because the trees in the distance over there, they don't have that same blocky artifact. Right there's a bit of shimmering, and it is a little bit unstable, but that's to be expected because we are running at 540p. All right, so 1080p testing almost done. Let's just see. I'm going to enable ray tracing, and then we'll just do some DLSS testing with ray tracing as well. Right, so I just enabled ray tracing. Now this is hardware ray tracing. As I said, the game uses Lumen software ray tracing all times. And now we are getting 66 frames per second. So, okay, now just look at the trees in the distance there. Now they're not blocky because we are rendering internally now at native resolution. So no upscaling, and the trees seem fine. So disregard all my previous statements I made about the geometry rendering. All right, so 66 frames per second here with DLSS or with ray tracing enabled. I'm going to enable DLSS quality here. All right, so DLSS quality got us back to our frame rate, which we had without ray tracing at native, so around 94 frames per second. That will test balanced, and then I think we'll move on to 1440p. All right, so balanced took us from 94 frames per second to 102 frames per second, but the trees in the distance become more and more blocky the more aggressive your upscaling, which makes sense. But 102 frames per second here with ray tracing enabled. I don't know. It's really very, very demanding, this game, right? Unoptimized, demanding, whatever. I'm not going to argue about semantics. I don't think the game should be this heavy. DLSS balanced, not netting us 100 plus frames per second at all times on a 4070 Ti Super at 1080p, and still the stuttering is there, and it's. You can you can see the stuttering is actually very like almost at the same time all the time, right? So moving back this way, it does not happen that much. But if we look back, sorry, I'm going to enable the lows now. I'm an idiot. I'm going to enable the lows quickly and just see. Let's see if I can remember the keys. Yeah, there we go. So look, if we run back down the stairs here, just look at when the stutters occur. They occur at the exact same intervals, right? Okay, so that's pretty strange. Now look at our 0.1% loads. We're sitting at 38 frames per second for the 0.1% loads, and that's just horrible. I don't think I personally would refund the game if it performs like this, which I'm going to do anyway. Well, actually, I'm just going to see what the performance is like with a day one patch. Hopefully it improves quite a bit, although I'm not holding my breath. If the performance is not acceptable by the time the day one patch releases, I'll be refunding. All right, so 104 frames per second average there, 85 for our 1% lows, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 38, so not ideal. All right, let's move on to 1440p. All right, so here we are at 1440p, epic preset, native, no DLSS, and no ray tracing, and we're getting 60-ish frames per second here. And honestly, okay, so fine, we're running at epic preset, right? And epic is the same as ultra, and I'd say it's reserved for higher tier GPUs. But to be honest, I'm expecting a little bit more from a 4070 Ti Super at 1440p native. It just seems way too heavy, especially considering that there's no hardware ray tracing enabled. It's only Lumen, although Lumen can be a little bit more demanding in some games, as is evident here. But just look at the stuttering once again. The frame time graph is very inconsistent. That translates to a lot of micro stutter, and you can see our 0.1% lows are pretty bad, sitting at 26 frames per second here, which is less than half of our average frame rate, and that's definitely something that you will notice. Right, so we're going to be doing the same testing here at 1440p. I think this is pretty much the same spot. We'll do the preset scaling, and then we'll do DLSS scaling, and then we'll test RT. Alright, so dropping down to the high preset, we go from 65 frames per second to 82 frames per second in the specific spot. The stuttering is still there even though you play on the low preset. That does not change at all with the presets. Just wanted to mention that. And then dropping down to the medium preset, we gain very little. Actually, we're sitting at 89 frames per second now, and you can see that the shadows and the reflections in the distance, they start shimmering quite a lot. All right, let's try the low preset. Let's see if it actually helps as much as it did at 1080p. And it actually helps quite a bit, right? We went from 90-ish frames per second to 125 frames per second, so a pretty decent boost our frame rate. If you don't mind the shimmering and the lower details, and you want a high refresh rate experience, then this is basically the settings that you should use, right? So let's go back to the epic preset. I want to show you what difference shadow quality alone makes, and then we'll test the DLSS presets. All right, so we're back on the epic preset native, no ray tracing, well, no hardware ray tracing. So 66 frames per second. I'll do this real time. So we'll go and change the shadow settings only. So if we go, yeah, you have to actually just select custom, right? And then you've got advanced quality settings. We'll select the epic preset here, and then just shadow quality, I'm just going to set this to low. Right, so if we go back into our game here, now you can see we gained around 20 frames per second, right, just by changing shadow detail. Now, how this would affect your immersion in the game, that's up for debate. Though I did not really notice that big a difference. I started a new game for this benchmark, right? I'm a little bit further in the game just to test, but this actually, shadow quality did not really adversely affect my gameplay experience. People would be different, so it might be different for you. Just play around with the settings if the performance is not acceptable to you. Right, so I'm going to change it back to the epic preset. We'll test the DLSS scaling next. Alright, so now we're back on the epic preset with DLSS set to quality. Previously at native, we were getting 66 frames per second. Now we're getting 96 frames per second. And the game still looks plenty good, except for the ghosting of the floating particles, right? So let's see balanced and then performance, and then we'll test ray tracing. Alright, so not that big a difference between quality and balanced, which makes sense because quality is 67% render resolution scale and balanced is 58% render resolution scale, so not that big a difference, and we only saw around 10 frames per second increase in our frame rate. And then DLSS performance increases that with another 10-12 frames per second, although I would highly advise against using DLSS performance even at 1440p. You can drop it down to DLSS ultra performance even as well. I'm not going to be testing that because I honestly really do not recommend that. All right, let's start with the ray trace testing. Alright, so here we have the Epic preset, once again, native resolution, and we have enabled hardware ray tracing, getting 47 frames per second. It's quite heavy, right? And it's not even the heaviest area, but you can see that the reflections are definitely much improved over Lumen reflections. The resolution of the reflections are definitely much higher, and also even without hardware ray tracing, it does not solely rely on screen space reflections. With the Lumen reflections, you can actually see full reflections as well. It's not just screen space. Right, so 40-ish frames per second here. So let's see, I'm going to enable DLSS quality. Let's see if we can actually maintain 60 frames per second here. Alright, so DLSS quality is enabled. I reset our numbers. I'm going to do a benchmark run here. Let's see if we can maintain 60 frames per second. I think this game would be fine at 60 frames per second for most people. The combat seems to be a little bit slow, and the game is quite slow paced, and you can see those stutters. Alright, it's and you can actually feel them as well. It's really pretty bad. And then when you get to this area over here, they stop for some reason. So it might be the way assets are loaded into the game here. Not entirely sure. I mean, it's Unreal Engine 5. It has become synonymous with stutter struggle, so not surprising, but it is annoying. Right, so DLSS quality with ray tracing enabled at 1440p is actually not too terrible if you do aim for 60 frames per second. Obviously, you can try and increase the frame rate a bit by changing the presets, but I think I'm not going to be doing everything in that video, or in this video, just because I don't want the video to be too long. But you can see maintaining 60 frames per second here is possible with DLSS set to quality and ray tracing enabled. All right, let's move over to 4K. Alright, so if you're aiming for 30 frames per second, we are now 4K native on the Epic preset, and I must say the game looks extremely good, but our frame rate is pretty low. I know some people that do play at 30 frames per second, nothing wrong with that at all if that's what you want. I personally just want a high frame rate. So 35 frames per second, definitely not ideal. It might drop below 30 frames per second even in our benchmark run. But let's do some preset scaling, and then we'll test the DLSS scaling, and then we'll test with ray tracing as well. Alright, so dropping down to the high preset gained us 13 frames per second, right? We went from 35 frames per second to 48 frames per second. Still not really close to that 60 frames per second, and that's what I'm targeting in this video. So let's drop this down to the medium preset. Right, and as with the previous resolutions as well, there's really no difference between the high and the medium preset in performance in this scene. So let's drop this down to the low preset. All right, so the low preset here gets us 67 frames per second. Not perfect, but it should... I don't think it's going to maintain 60 frames per second either, just based on my previous runs. Once we actually run down the forest path, it drops into the high 50s. So it's not going to maintain 60, and at 4K you will definitely have to use DLSS here. Right, so let's change this back to I think I'm going to be using the high preset rather than the Epic preset, and then we'll play with the DLSS. Right, so the high preset previously at native resolution got us to around 45, 46 frames per second. Now we're getting 64 frames per second. It's not going to maintain 60 frames per second because I'm repeating myself, I know, but 64 frames per second looking this way, we will drop into the mid 50s in other areas. But now you can see the ghosting with DLSS, right? And if you move around, if you move the camera, the ghosting disappears. This is the same issue that Spider-Man actually has, and it is fixed by using the DLSS E preset. And for that, you can use DLSS tweaks to change the preset to E, and that should fix most of the ghosting in this scenario anyway. Right, so DLSS quality 65 frames per second. Let's try balanced. All right, so balanced took us to 76 frames per second, which is a pretty decent bump, I think. And next up we'll try performance, and then I'll do the benchmark run just with DLSS performance to see how it performs. Now DLSS performance at 4K looks plenty good in this game. It's definitely still usable, except for the ghosting, right? All right, so DLSS performance took us from mid 70s to mid 80s, and I'm going to do my benchmark run here quickly. It actually stays in the mid 80s here, the high 80s. Let's see if we can actually hit 90 frames per second here. We should be able to, but let's just have a look at the stuttering. Like, it should start happening again at set intervals. There we go. I mean, if I stand still, it doesn't happen, right? So I lied. So there we go. So if I stand still, it doesn't happen. So it has to be with loading in asset, right? And it's definitely something they should work on. And so if I was playing at 4K, which this monitor actually is a 4K 60 monitor, the DLSS performance is probably where I'd be playing. Maybe balanced if I was able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. This is not a horrible experience, but it is still very heavy that you have to use DLSS performance to get around 80 frames per second, right? So DLSS performance is 1080p internal render resolution. So going to come back to my area here, and then we'll test ray tracing actually and see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. Right, so I left it on the high preset just with DLSS quality enabled now, and ray tracing is enabled, hardware ray tracing, and we are seeing 50-ish frames per second. So I do think we'll probably have to use DLSS performance again to maintain 60 frames per second. I mean, we had to do that at native anyway. Balanced was almost enough, but I don't think balanced will be enough here. Right, so balanced, the bump that up to 58 frames per second. So let's try performance again. Right, and DLSS performance has us at around 68 frames per second here. So let's start our benchmark run. Let's see if it maintains 60. No, 58 frames per second. So DLSS ultra performance with ray tracing is the only way you'll be able to hit 60 frames per second at 4K, right? Unfortunate, but that's the way it is. I do know some people that use this GPU for 4K gaming because it does have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and it's no slouch at 4K, but you have to use upscaling, and in this game you have to use aggressive upscaling if you want to use ray tracing as well. Right, so 70-ish frames per second, but once again our 0.1% lows, which indicate stuttering is quite low, less than half of our frame rate once again, and that's just not a very good experience. Right, I think that's going to be the end of this video. I think I tested enough settings. I'll re-look at this game. I'll have a re-look at this game, sorry, once it actually launches, officially launches. I'll see if there's a day one patch, and then I'll also do a video featuring the RX 6700 XT GPU. Right, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.